Hi class. In this recording, we're going to focus on skin color and some of the extra features of our skin that we can see, some of the markings that we see on our skins. Our skin, not skin, skin, singular. Hopefully you don't have plural skins on your body. So as we look at our skin, the single most significant factor that gives us color to our skin is this wonderful pigment called melanin. And there are two different kinds, two flavors of melanin, so to speak. We have eumelanin. This prefix eu means true. So a eukaryote, I'm a biologist, so I think of eukaryotes all the time. That is literally means true kernel, or they have a true nucleus in their center. Eumelanin is what most people think of when they think of melanin, or it's the most common kind of melanin, and it's the most noticeable by far. It gives us a dark pigmentation, that brown-black pigmentation. We also have phenomelanin, or phetomelanin. And as we look, and I know I struggle with pronunciation, like most people do. As we look at this kind of melanin, this is kind of a reddish yellow melanin because it contains a lot of sulfur atoms. So individuals that have a little bit more of a red-yellow pigmentation to their skin tend to have higher concentrations of phetomelanin relative to the eumelanin. Both of these kinds of melanin, though, will be made by a melanocyte. And I know I said this in a previous recording, but I want to emphasize melanocytes make melanin. They do not make melatonin. Melanin is a pigment. Melatonin is a neurotransmitter. Now, this I find to be really cool. Even though, you look around, you look in a crowd of people, all these different people have all these different levels of pigmentation or melanin in their skins. We have different skin colors across a wide spectrum of people. But even though those people have different skin colors, they all have the same number of melanocytes. And that's just crazy to me, because I remember when I was a younger individual, when I was in high school and taking my first A&P class, I thought if you had really dark skin, you must have lots of melanocytes, and if you have really light skin, you must have hardly any, and that is not the case. The difference between somebody with dark skin and light skin, or in between, isn't the number of melanocytes. The difference is how active those melanocytes are and where the melanocytes dump their melanin. So the biggest issue, or the biggest factor for fair skin versus dark skin, is the activity. Dark skinned people have more melanin produced than light skinned individuals. And this melanin is going to spread out more evenly through the keratinocytes of the epidermis. And because it spreads out more evenly throughout the keratinocytes of the epidermis, it is going to be present for a longer period of time. It breaks down more slowly. Individuals with fair skin or lighter colored skin are going to have melanin dumped near the nucleus of the keratinocyte, and that's going to cause the melanin to not be present as long. It tends to break down a little bit quicker. We can still see a little bit of melanin beyond the stratum basale. Think of a fair skin or a Caucasian individual who gets a tan in the summer. It's still possible. I know I'm deviating from the slides a little bit here, and this is a hormone we don't talk about in the endocrine system. But the hormone related to melanocytes is called melanocyte stimulating hormone. MSH is the abbreviation for melanocyte stimulating hormone. And it's a really cool hormone that, as its name implies, causes your melanocytes to make more melanin. And if you want to look, if you really want to get the best possible tan, the most even tan in your life that you'll ever have in your life, don't go to the fake booth or the tanning booth. Don't spend a bunch of time lying in the yard, getting sunbathing. Just get an injection of melanocyte stimulating hormone. It'll travel through your bloodstream and evenly stimulate all the melanocytes of your body to have increased rates of pigmentation. There are some diseases associated with elevated melanocyte stimulating hormone in the human body. In particular, I'm thinking of Addison's disease. So if you look at it, and I'll talk about this in a couple slides. So I'll stop for now. We'll get to that in just a little bit. So here's somebody that has darker skin. Here's somebody who has lighter skin. And structurally, there's really no difference between their skin. The difference is the activity of the melanocytes within the stratum basale. So individuals with dark pigmentation to their skin have more active melanocytes, and you can see the brown melanin granules being embedded within the keratinocytes of individuals that have darker skin. And then individuals with fair skin don't have that wonderful pigment melanin in their skin, so, or as much of it, so you tend to not see it in the photomicrographs that they look at. And I know for me in particular, I wish I had a little bit more natural, like a higher baseline of melanin in my skin, because then I wouldn't get as many sunburns, and I wouldn't have to worry as much about skin cancer when I get older. I mean, there are some distinct advantages to having increased levels of melanin production in your skin. On the flip side, though, to talk about a disadvantage of having increased melanin production, individuals that have very high levels of melanin in their skin tend to have a harder time getting that ultraviolet radiation down into the dermis to aid with vitamin D synthesis. So there's a bit of a trade-off. Melanin can help reduce rates of skin cancer and sunburn, but it also reduces the rate of vitamin D synthesis. Oh, wrong button. Here we go. Next slide. So, as I had mentioned, we have UV light as a significant factor that will stimulate the melanocytes. And UV light, or that ultraviolet radiation, will cause the melanocytes to make more melanin. And then our tan, that melanin will stick around, or our tan will stick around, until those cells of the epidermis are exfoliated off or sloughed off the surface of our skin. The technical term is desquamation because we are removing squamous cells, desquamation or desquamation. Now, there's other things that influence our skin color other than just melanin. We have hemoglobin within our erythrocytes, within our red blood cells. Hemoglobin has iron in it, and the iron, particularly iron plus oxygen, iron 3 oxide, is going to have a reddish pigmentation to it and can add a red or pink hue to our skin depending on how much our superficial blood vessels are dilated. We also have keratin, which is a yellow pigment, yellow-orange pigment that can be present in our skin. We get keratin from egg yolks and orange vegetables. If you want to have some fun Googling images, you should Google the pumpkin diet. It was a fad diet that used to be popular. And in this diet, people would eat pumpkin and squash, only orange vegetables. And because they had lots and lots of orange vegetables in their diet, they had excessive amounts of keratin in their body, and they actually started to have orange skin. And I thought it was just nuts that your diet could cause your skin to turn orange. But it's a thing. It's pretty extreme. But if your goal in life is to have orange skin, eat lots of pumpkin, eat lots of squash and carrots, and eventually you'll start to get orangish colored skin. As we look at this keratin, it's going to be concentrated in the subcutaneous fat and the stratum corneum of our integument. Skin color is important from a diagnostic perspective. You can look at somebody's skin and make some health inferences based on the color of the skin that's being presented. So, for instance, if they have a blue coloration to their skin, that's known as cyanosis. And that's usually used to indicate some kind of oxygen deficiency. So for myself in particular, I typically see cyanosis represented. I think of like the skinny little kids at the public swimming pool who are having so much fun swimming, they don't care that they're freezing their tushies off and their lips turn blue. So in my mind, blue lips or blue extremities in particular are the most common. I will commonly associate that with a decreased body temperature, but it also could imply hypoxia or a reduction in blood oxygen levels. We have eurythmia. That's typically, most people just call that flushed in common English. So you have a bunch of redness to the skin or elevated red pigmentation to the skin because you have increased blood flow to the skin. So for myself in particular, when I see eurythmia, I think elevated body temperature. And when I see cyanosis, I think decreased body temperature. We also have pallor. And I know I'm trying to color code my words here, but because pallor is usually going to be really white skin, having white text on a white background, doesn't work very well. And when we think of pallor, we have decreased blood flow to the skin, and the reduction of blood to the skin is going to cause the skin to lose a lot of its pigmentation. And you can see this if you squeeze your hands tightly, just make a tight fist and then release it. You can see how there's some white patches on your skin that slowly fade in and get some more pink or red coloration as the blood recirculates to those regions of your dermis. Pallor is not to be confused with albinism or being an albino. And this is somebody who genetically does not have the ability to produce melanin. So their skin isn't going to have any brown or black pigmentation. It's going to be a milky white skin, or you could still have the red blood cells, so you can have maybe bright pink skin. Their eyes tend to be blue or gray depending on the kind of albinism they have, because they just don't have that melanin in their bodies. They also tend to have kind of white or yellowish white hair as you look at their bodies. I remember when I was in grade school, there was a young lady 1 grade above me in school who was albino. And I felt so bad for her because her skin was always bright red. Because she couldn't produce any melanin, she would become sunburned on the drop of a dime. She would just always have a constant sunburn. And then I remember another individual I met who had albinism. He lived in the Bahamas, and I was down there doing some coral reef studies, and I've never seen somebody with such bad sunburns in my life. And I couldn't comprehend why somebody who was albino would choose to live that close to the equator. Oh, it just looked painful. Another skin color is yellow, and when your skin starts to turn yellowish, that's referred to as jaundice. That's typically due to excessive amounts of bilirubin in the blood, and it's usually in adults. That's going to indicate that the liver is not functioning correctly. So it's oftentimes going to be associated with hepatitis or alcoholism in adults. For newborn children, they just haven't had enough time to clear the bilirubin from their bodies. So a lot of times you'll have mild jaundice in newborn children. My oldest child had that. And the best way to clear excessive levels of bilirubin from the body is to go and defecate, or to poop, to use the common English term. And a lot of times what you see in newborn infants, particularly ones that have jaundice, is that the very first time they have a poopy diaper, it's this thick, black, tarry substance called meconium, because it just has sky-high bilirubin and bilirubin derivatives within it. And then as blood bilirubin levels go back down to baseline, the stool in the diaper goes from that thick black stool to more of your standard brownish colored stool. We also could have hematoma, which is a technical term for a bruise, or more technically speaking, clotted blood under the skin. And the hematoma will usually be blue, red, green, yellow. It's kind of a rainbow, a smorgasbord of colors. In my mind, I think of the Eagle Nebula, that classic photo taken by the Hubble telescope, whenever I see a hematoma. And then we have bronzing of the skin. No, it's not a double R, but I just have fun trilling my R's. And when I think of bronzing of the skin, that's somebody who's ridiculously tan. And it's not necessarily, it's one thing to be ridiculously tan if you're spending a ridiculous amount of time in a tanning booth or out in the sun. But This is somebody who's going to be really, really tan, who should not be really, really tan. And one of the easiest ways to diagnose bronzing is to look at somebody's gum line. If their gums are tan, that means there's something weird going on. So particularly if you look at somebody of Hispanic or Latino or Caucasian descent, the individuals from those racial groups, generally speaking, or Asian descent, generally speaking, don't have a lot of pigment in their gums. Their gums are supposed to be pink. But if you look at their gums and they have black gum lines in their mouths or a lot of melanin within their gums, that means that they have elevated levels of melanocyte stimulating hormone within their bodies. And that is a secondary symptom of a hormonal disease known as Addison's disease. Hopefully, you never encounter somebody with Addison's disease. I've only known one individual with Addison's disease in my life, and he was a teenager and almost died because it's such a rare disease that it went undiagnosed for about 9 months. So I'm going to camp on this one for a little bit. If you notice somebody who's experiencing rapid weight loss, reduced appetite, and excessive fatigue, and excessive levels of tanning or bronzing of their skin, those are combined. That suite of symptoms is a red flag for an endocrine disorder known as Addison's disease. Yeah, I spent a lot of time on this slide, but hey, there's a lot of good stuff. Now let's talk about ancestry and skin color. As we look at our skin color, there's multiple things that can influence our skin color. The biggest one is going to be exposure to UV light. And generally speaking, if your ancestors had to deal with a lot of ultraviolet radiation, individuals who naturally made more pigment in their skin, naturally made more melanin, are going to be selected for. Because if you think of living near the equator, if you didn't make any melanin, so if you're albino, you'd be constantly sunburned and you'd have dramatically accelerated rates of skin cancer. And generally speaking, if you're constantly sunburned and constantly dealing with skin cancer, it's going to be more difficult for you to have kids. So individuals whose ancestors were traditionally exposed to lots of ultraviolet radiation, generally speaking, are going to have the genetic predisposition to make more melanin in their skin. And our genetics, our ancestry, produces or accounts for most of the variation in our skin pigmentation. And this is why you can see somebody whose ancestors are from the equator, but they can be living in Northern Europe and never see the sun and still have really dark skin because of their genetics that they inherited. So as we think of this UV light, it's kind of a double-edged sword. It's bad because it accelerates skin cancer and it accelerates the breakdown of folic acid in our body, but it's good because it's a part of vitamin D synthesis. So we need to have, a happy medium in the amount of pigmentation and UV light or ultraviolet light exposure in our bodies. One of the things that confused me when I was a younger individual is why people of Eskimo or Inuit descent, from those far, far Arctic Circle northern latitudes, why do they have, generally speaking, in their ancestry, elevated skin pigmentation? It's not like there's elevated sun exposure up there. I mean, they're at a very oblique angle to the sun. But the reason why individuals from those far northern latitudes, near the Arctic Circle, traditionally have darker skin pigmentation is because they're constantly having sunlight reflected up from the white snow. So they get the light from the sun directly, and they have accelerated amounts of reflected light coming back up at their faces and skin. So even though the sun is at an oblique angle in that part of the world, and they don't get a lot of direct sunlight exposure, there's a increase in reflected sunlight exposure for those far northern latitudes. So individuals from those regions of the world genetically are predisposed to have kind of a brown or medium tan skin pigmentation level. But generally speaking, people near the equator, near the tropics, are going to have the highest sun exposure traditionally and the highest levels of melanin in their skin. So as we look at individuals that are in the far, that are in northern and southern latitudes, and I think generally speaking between 30 degrees and 60 degrees of latitude, they tend to have weaker sunlight exposure and will have less pigmentation to their skin. And then once you get up to those far northern latitudes, the Arctic circle levels, so between, let's say, 80 and 90 degrees latitude, or 75 and 90 degrees of latitude, then you're going to have actually an uptick in pigmentation and an uptick in reflected sunlight. So in these regions, there's also going to be a thinner level to the atmosphere, and there's going to be a thinner layer to the ozone, a thinner ozone layer. And because the ozone layer is thinner, we also are going to see increased UV exposure and darker skin. Now, when we think of vitamin D is really important because we need vitamin D in our body to absorb calcium from our digestive tract. So when you look at calcium supplements, I'm thinking of like the Viactive chocolate flavored chews, you'll typically have vitamin D paired with calcium in that supplement. And we need that vitamin D to absorb the calcium. And this is important for people who are experiencing increased calcium use or a calcium shortage in their body. So think of women who are pregnant. They're constantly dumping calcium from their own skeletal system into the growing skeletal system of that fetus or that unborn child. And then if you think of somebody who's actively lactating, so a woman who's breastfeeding, that individual is going to be dumping lots of calcium into the breast milk. And again, they're going to be experiencing a calcium shortage. So as we look at women versus genetic females versus genetic males, so somebody who's a biological male versus a biological female, a woman versus a man, what we find is that, generally speaking, and this is kind of a, squint your eyes and fudge, but it's weird because generally speaking, women have a little bit lighter pigmentation than men. And even when they have similar lifestyles and similar family backgrounds, there's still this general phenomenon that occurs. And it may be the importance of vitamin D and vitamin D synthesis for pregnancy and breastfeeding that could be a possible explanation for this. So, hey, I think that's kind of cool. As we look at our skin color, I also want to emphasize that there are other issues with skin color, other things that can influence skin color. So right now, our world is more connected than it ever was before. So we have lots of migration. And as people groups move around the world, we have the birds and the bees, people, from different people groups become attracted to each other. And we begin to have more intermarriage between people of different races or geographic ancestries, if you want to say it that way. So we're finding that even if we're mixing and matching more ancestries right now in individuals. Also, cultural differences in the amount of clothing and the kind of shelter that you live in are also going to influence your skin color. So if you're in a family and maybe your parents just like to throw you outside constantly when you were a kid, you're probably really tan as a kid. Or maybe when you were a kid, your parents never went outside, never went camping, and spent all their time inside reading books and looking at movies and TV. You probably have paler skin. And you can even see this in individuals who have, turns out I didn't include that figure. Individuals who have, maybe they're cattle ranchers and they're exposed to the sunlight constantly, they'll have really dark, leathery skin. Or if they are a monk in a monastery and they spend decades out of the sun, they'll have very light, fair skin. Something else that's an influencing factor is sexual selection. And that sounds awfully sterile and technical, but more generally speaking, what's your personal preference? Do you like it if your partner, your spouse, or the person that you would potentially be reproducing with has some darker skin, some lighter skin? I mean, there is something to be said for your own individual personal preference on who you would be reproducing with. And that could influence the skin color of your potential offspring. Moving on, let's talk about skin markings. So we have friction ridges. Friction ridges are also known as fingerprints. And our fingerprints, in common English, our fingerprints, we think of them as both the ridges on our hand and those oily marks that we leave on surfaces that we touch. Every human being on the planet, even genetically identical twins, have unique friction ridges, and by extension, unique fingerprints. And this allows for us to manipulate small objects. Our fingerprints change over our life cycles or over our lifespan too. I know for me in particular, as I've aged, I've cut my hands and my fingers more. And as I have more boo-boos and owies on my hands, I have more scars develop on my hand, and those scars will alter my friction ridges and fingerprints. You probably noticed on your body, though, how we have flexion lines, and you can see them even on your hand. So if you look on the palm of your hand, most people will have 3 very prominent flexion lines on the palm of your hands, or creases. You can even see them between the individual phalanxes of your bones of your fingertips. And we find that the skin, the collagen fiber at those areas, is going to have fibers oriented parallel to those lines. And these flexion lines, surgically speaking, are important because when you are making a surgical incision in a patient, you want these flexion lines, you want to typically cut perpendicular to the flexion lines, so that you can have, not perpendicular, you want to cut parallel to these flexion lines so that you can have your wound site and your sutures be more likely to heal rapidly. We also have freckles and moles. These freckles and moles are just areas where we have a higher concentration of melanocytes. And generally speaking, the technical definition between a freckle and mole isn't the amount of pigmentation, it's the 3-dimensional shape. If it's 2-dimensional and flat-ish, we call it a freckle. If it's 3-dimensional, we call it a mole, technically known as a nevi. And when we look at moles are kind, well, not a red flag necessarily, but we'll call them a yellow flag situation. You want to monitor your moles to see if they're changing color, or if they're growing, or if they get bumpier. Because if your moles are actively changing throughout over a year or over a couple of weeks or months, that's a red flag event that maybe you have some kind of skin cancer that you're dealing with. So if you have a 3-dimensional mark or a mole or nevi, just, keep an eye on it. Make sure it doesn't change on you. We also could have a Hemenogea, aka a birthmark. And the difference, technically speaking, when we talk about a birthmark is going to have a pink or red coloration to it because we have an excessive amount of capillaries associated with that mark. So a birthmark is not a freckle or a mole. I know when I was a teenager, thought freckles or moles could be birthmarks. No, a birthmark technically is not from excessive pigmentation from a melanocyte. It's from excessive blood supply due to lots of blood capillaries in the dermis. Sometimes they are going to be 3-dimensional. Those are called a strawberry hemangiorrhea. And sometimes they're just 2-dimensional. Generally speaking, they are going to fade as we age. So those blood capillaries will be diluted out as the surface area of our skin expands. Sometimes, though, they will last the entire lifespan or our entire life cycle. And there's different varieties of hemangiorrheas. So we have that commonly known as the strawberry hemangiorrhea, but we also have some other technical names. We have the capillary hemangiorrhea, the cavernous, or the port wine stain. So there's variations of how these birthmarks manifest each other. That's all we have for this discussion on skin color and skin markings. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to post them in the class discussion board or to shoot me an email. And as always, happy studies.